many, many pages in What is Islam, explaining that this is not a civilizational account, that the word civilization is too limited, that our mistake comes from thinking that Islam is a body of laws and binding normative orthodox teachings. Remember, he had worked on the birth of orthodoxy. And that every other aspect of Islam is something else again, is Persian poetry, is classical philosophy with an Aristotelian Platonic bent, is Sufi mysticism. All of these are often thought to be not the law, and therefore in some way less Islam. And in What is Islam, all 625 pages of it, Shahab shows again with an extraordinary combination of depth of erudition, breadth of knowledge, and extraordinary leaps of creativity, that in fact Islam itself must be understood as the complicated and often contradictory combination of the law and of the philosophy and of the mysticism and of the poetry and indeed of the wine drinking itself, archetypally prohibited by the law, yet central both metaphorically and, he insisted, literally to the achievement of higher consciousness. Now, again, most scholars would have stopped there, patted themselves on the back and said, I've written the most important book in Islamic studies in a decade or two, I'm done. But Shahab didn't. Shahab wanted further to make an argument, not about Islam merely as a contradiction, but he wanted to show that notwithstanding the contradiction, there was a there there. There was within Islamic studies something that could be identified as the core of Islam. The rest of us would have said, postmodernity is such a wonderful thing. I've shown the contradictions and I'm out the door. I know I would have. But no, Shahab built a substantive theory in which Islam could be understood and constructed as hermeneutic engagement and lived engagement with the text of the Quran, the pretext, that is, the philosophical underpinnings of the entire cosmos, understood as laying the groundwork for the text, and the context understood as the meaning-making activities of those who call themselves Muslims. This is a generative theory of a kind that people will be arguing about for many, many years. It was not an easy case to make, and Shahab did not make it easily. It took many years to develop the knowledge. It took more years to express the views. But most of all, it took an extraordinary capacity for free thought to be able to produce an argument that de-centered precisely the work that he had first done. It took 6th, 7th, and 8th century Arabia out of the center of the picture. That is something that I think almost no scholar I know has done. Produce profound scholarship that displaces his earlier profound scholarship. Doesn't refute it, doesn't disprove it, doesn't even disagree with it. Says that in some way it is secondary to the fundamental project with which he's been engaged. Now, it took Shahab a long time to do these things, and work of this kind does not come easily, and it does not come without struggle. Until this moment, I didn't know about the quotation of Thoreau's that Shala gave us in her great montage of photographs, in which Shahab was apparently interested from the time he was a child in the idea that if you appear to be lagging behind your fellows, it may be you have something else in mind. I think he was prefiguring his later academic experiences in that regard. That said, I think that when the history of Islamic studies at our great university, which I, for one, love so well, is written, I think it will be seen and said that for the depth of his erudition, for the breadth of his knowledge, and for the features of his creativity, no scholar of the field at Harvard will have made a greater impact since the time of Sir Hamilton Gibb, and I think that Shahab would have given Professor Gibb a run for his money. I just want to close by referring back again to my conversation with my kids this morning. And I asked Jamin and Mina what word they would use to describe Shahab. And they said, they thought about it for a few minutes, and they said, we think of Shahab as joyful. I love that because, as you all know, Shahab was not always joyful. And what's extraordinary about it is when they saw him, when he came to our house, when he talked to them, engaged with them, we were usually drinking some sort of beverage the scholars may not have approved of. We might have been smoking the Indonesian clove cigarettes that he brought it only on special occasions. We were talking about ideas. We were talking about Shahab's ideas. And in those moments, Shahab was genuinely joyful. And so was I.
About 10 years ago, can you hear me? Am I too loud? About 10 years ago, I co-edited a volume in memory of my late professor of Columbia University, Magda Nuehi. After she was diagnosed with cancer in her early 40s, she started working on Arabic elegiac poetry. And unfortunately, she passed before she was able to publish anything. So my co-editor and I were trying to find anything that she had written so that we can include in our volume. And we dug up a lecture that she had given in Arabic to Arabic language students, which included a lot of quotations of elegiac poetry. And it fell upon me to translate that piece and the poetry. And of course, as soon as poetry is mentioned, who am I going to ask to help me? Shahab. And so we were in Jordan, and I asked my mother and Shahab to sit with me because my mother knew the nuances of the Arabic and Shahab knew the nuances of the English. And we sat there for the whole afternoon working on the poetry. And of all the little excerpts that we read and translated, the one excerpt that caught Shahab's imagination was a poem by the 11th century poet Abu al-Ala al-Ma'arri. And he just wouldn't stop talking about it for the rest of the day. So this is the poem that I'm going to read. But I should say that the poem is not an elegy per se. It is a contemplation of life and death, and actually about the futility of life. And it's so famous in Arabic that it has so many titles, because every line is proverbial, and it depends on which line that you like. That you give the title. And Shahab chose تعب كلها الحياة. Weariness is all of life. صاحي هذه قبورنا تملأ الرحب فأين القبور من عهد عادي. خفف الوطأة ما أظن أديم الأرض إلا من هذه الأجساد. وقبيح بنا وإن قدم العهد هوان الآباء والأجداد. سر إن استطعت سر في الهواء رويدا لا اختيالا على رفات العباد. رب لحد قد صار لحدا مرارا ضاحك من تزاحم الأضداد. ودفين على بقايا دفين في طويل الأزمان والآباد. Oh friend, these graves of ours fill the expanses, and where are the graves of the age of Ad? Lighten your tread. I do not think the face of the earth is composed of else but these bodies. And it is foul for us, even if a long time has passed, to disrespect our fathers and our forefathers. Walk if you can, walk gently in the air, not trudging over the bones of worshippers. Many a grave becomes over a grave again, laughing at the jamming together of rivals. And remains are buried on top of remains along the length of time into eternity.
Good evening. I'm a graduate student in history here at Harvard and just one of many here today who had the fortune of having Shahab as a teacher. I'd been hesitant to accept this impossible task of speaking on behalf of Shahab's students, not due to lack of words. In fact, those who know me would recall the sheer deluge of words and emotion in the wake of this tragedy. But impossible because I can't possibly do justice to the legacy and the richness of Shahab's teaching career, though I have to say that Professor Feldman's incredibly eloquent and succinct description of Shahab as a scholar should be very helpful for me. I should perhaps begin with a story, since we all know that's exactly what Shahab would have done. The day I met him almost 8 years ago now was at the very first meeting of his lecture class, Vocabulary of Islam. It was shopping period, and he was giving an overview of the course. Towards the end of the meeting, as he was taking questions from the students, someone asked rather inappropriately, "Are you Muslim?" The whole class went quiet as we waited in terrible, awkward silence. Shahab did not utter a word in reply. He turned around, picked up a piece of chalk, and spelled out on the blackboard, "Muhammad Shahab Ahmed." I can't quite remember, but I think he might have even put diacritics on the ha. We all burst into amused, knowing chuckles, although now in the spirit of that first anecdote about a Princeton dinner at the beginning of Shahab's book, I can almost imagine that some in the class were perhaps wondering, "We don't understand," while the rest of us were thinking, "But we do." Vocabulary of Islam, which we'd refer to in short as vocab, has been a formative experience for many generations of Harvard students, both graduate and undergraduate. It's the class he taught the most often, almost every year, and to describe it as introductory would belie the intensive and expansive scope of what he covered and how much he made us read. The course was meant to serve as a roadmap for the serious study of Islam. In fact, Shahab once described it as akin to the knowledge, so-called, the notorious test that London cabbies have to take to prove their mental map of the city. Vocab served as a thorough primer in all of the major disciplines internal to the Islamic tradition, from Quranic tafsir, hadith, theology, to law, philosophy, and Sufism, to art, music, and architecture. The class was effectively also an articulation of Shahab's vision and understanding of Islam, anticipating, in fact, many of the ideas that he would go on to explain in his book, What is Islam? Like Walt Whitman's poetic self, Shahab the teacher was indeed large and contained multitudes, if not contradictions. 10 years ago, in 2005, he taught an entire seminar devoted to Ibn Taymiyyah. 5 years later, he decided to teach a class on another very different seminal figure, Ibn Arabi. Back in his first 2 years of teaching at Harvard, Shahab offered 2 year-long seminars on the fundamentals, first on Hadith and the second on Quran. In subsequent years, Shahab chose instead to teach the fundamentals through what may be regarded as his flagship seminar, the year-long graduate course on the Satanic versus Problem in History, the topic that has been his life's work ever since his PhD thesis. The class had no syllabus. After all, it covered pretty much everything, from late medieval tafsirs still in unedited manuscripts to 19th century Indian Muslim literature in journals and pamphlets. Of course, Shahab's propensity for everything is well known. Years ago, even before I had met him, perhaps almost a decade ago, I had heard of Shahab being described as the guy who does everything, whom you couldn't pin down with just one or another of the particular subfields within Islamic studies. Note also his particular preference for teaching a single course over a full academic year. Even that wasn't enough, actually. Most days in class, we couldn't get through everything we had set out to do, because Shahab's meticulous attention to detail meant we could sometimes spend 30 minutes puzzling over a single line of Arabic. There were 2 things most characteristic of a graduate seminar with Shahab. First, what a former student described as the temperamentally torturous series of questions that would punctuate the entire discussion or closed reading of a text. Second were the digressions. As you all know, Shahab was perhaps more than anything else an incurable storyteller. and he just relished every opportunity to tell one. By now, I think most of his students have heard at least twice, if not more than that, about his crazy landlord in Cairo back when he was a student there, or about that one time a shoddy archivist let him sneak out a manuscript outside of the library to the neighborhood photocopier. These stories were what made him so human and so affable, this man who otherwise intimidated quite a few of us with his unmatched erudition and his eloquence. In more recent years, in addition to his iconic seminar on orthodoxy, which he taught in several iterations, and a new class on sources and methods for research in Islamic studies, essentially modeled after the Princeton seminars at which he himself was trained, Shahab's teaching also took a highly creative turn as he set out to resolve certain basic problems that were intriguing him in relation to the question of what is Islam. He taught a course on metaphor and meaning, another one on the concepts of the public and the private, and another on the social and cultural history of Islamic law. The syllabi for almost all of these were lengthy, systematic bibliographies of up to 60 or so items, including whole books and articles. The amount of reading for Shahab's classes have always been the source of much anxiety among many of us and of many campus stories as well. I once heard a legend many years ago about the first meeting of one of his seminars. He brought a huge pile of texts in multiple languages, of course, and placed it on the table in front of him. When a student remarked that it looked like an awful lot of reading for the semester, Shahab replied, "Oh, this is just for next week." So you can imagine why some of us students were quite terrified of him. Even after years of knowing him, we could still feel those nagging self-doubts about not being intelligent enough for his attention or company. But he was paradoxically also the young professor, the one who seemed almost like us. He was the one teacher we'd run into regularly at Widener Library, where he'd often be working all day at the Felix reading room. Last year during spring break, I even found him camped out all week in the departmental seminar room of the fourth floor at Barker, with books sprawling on the large table while he was frantically writing away. Shahab was a man full of surprises. Students would learn to reconcile the image of his impeccably refined and eloquent command in the lecture room with his surprisingly soft-spoken and gentle nature in person, not to mention that he could even be a bit shy. He was also incredibly generous with his students, especially those who sincerely sought his help. Believe it or not, I know of several students with whom he met individually on a regular basis to go over very basic Arabic grammar. And this wasn't just a one-way process either. He always wanted to learn from us and truly cared for our opinions. For instance, when some of his advisees were taking their religion pro seminar in theory and method, Shahab would regularly ask them about the most interesting readings that they've encountered recently. And then he would actually follow up and read those so that he could have a discussion with them. No doubt Shahab challenged all of us who came under his shadow, not least through his honesty and frankly expressed judgment, of which I'm sure I'm not the only one to have been at the receiving end. And it is precisely because he was so challenging that he made a difference in our lives and helped us become better students and thinkers. The Ashab Shahab are a vast and diverse community. Even his specialized graduate seminars drew students who were not primarily medievalists or even Islamicists. He has taught anthropologists, Sanskrit philologists, students of ancient and modern religions, and historians spanning the Maghreb to colonial India. Today, his former students include academics in comparative literature, to human rights lawyers in Europe, to activists working at UN refugee camps. I think this remarkable impact of his teaching is explained partly by Shahab's devoted commitment to and concern for the human condition. His passionate humanism was clearly evident even in the classroom. As for instance, in vocab, when he organized an extra session for us to listen to some of his impressive personal collection of music, ranging all the way from classical Sufi chants from the Balkans and the Punjab, all the way to contemporary North African rap and even Palestinian hip-hop. The weight of Shahab's strong personality bore so heavily on our relationship to him as a teacher that I've lately come to realize how Shahab's influence perfectly embodies that quintessential ethos of learning in the Islamic tradition throughout history. And it is exactly in this regard I now feel that no matter how much we will continue to learn from the written words he has left behind, We will miss him so dearly in person, especially his ubiquitous presence on this campus. People inevitably ask, were you close to him? I have trouble responding when I don't know the answer myself. How do you explain what closeness means when you never even considered yourself worthy of someone's regard, and yet you commanded your every attention? When Shahab left us, I was struggling to understand this experience of sudden loss of a teacher, and in many ways I still am. After all, what does it mean to lose when you feel like you never really got enough of him to begin with? How does one grieve the loss of a teacher and a scholar whose ideas and writings remain forever and who is therefore never really lost? Especially one whose words are just about to commence their enduring legacy, one who is being described by so many people as the most brilliant person they have ever known. What does it mean to feel so deeply and so personally about someone whose greatness well transcends your own particularity, who was great precisely because he touched the lives and minds of so many? Personally, I am consumed with regret at not having done enough with him, even for him. How then can I lose when I feel like I didn't even have? And yet that persistent lack makes this loss so much more confounding. After all, who do you look for and look up to when the one whose impossible approval you'd been seeking all along is there no more? We miss you, Shahab, all of us who learned so much from you, and we're looking forward to so much more. All of us who never tired of your stories in the classroom, or even those days that you were so cranky, and even your grumpy complaints and your occasionally silly jokes. I miss you, Professor Ahmed. When I said goodbye to you that other day back in May before heading out for the summer and you were preparing for your move to Princeton, I didn't really mean it because I could have never imagined in 1,000 years that it would be forever, that I would never see you again. And lastly, thank you for making us so much better.